and thank you for joining us for another episode of Hope for Healthcare with Dr. Katie Cole in partnership with ICD Healthcare Network. Dr. Katie Cole is a holistic physician, organizational well-being consultant, and change agent, working with industry leaders and proven strategies to heal our national healthcare system and our culture of medicine. Stay tuned to hear today's speaker.
Well, welcome everyone to Hope for Healthcare. This is a podcast in which we interview expert leaders around the country on best practices for healing our national healthcare system and culture of medicine. I want to extend a very warm welcome today to my colleague, Dr. Jody Stern, and I also had the honor of moderating his panel discussion with Dr. Reese at the Burnout Symposium in February. Dr. Stern is Clinical Assistant Professor of Neurosurgery, University of North Carolina School of Medicine, and author of Grief Connects Us, a Neurosurgeon's Lessons on Love, Loss, and Compassion. And here's a copy, and we'll be getting into that today. He was propelled by his younger sister, Victoria's surprise diagnosis of acute leukemia, an unsuccessful bone marrow transplant, and later her death, followed by her husband, Pat's death from a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. Orphaning their two children, Dr. Stern has been exploring the impact of her illness had on him, as well as the personal experiences of physicians and patients going through similarly disruptive losses. Dr. Stern advocates for greater compassion and empathy in the way we treat each other and our patients, and offers suggestions on how we can improve healthcare delivery to achieve these goals. He is also a TEDx speaker, inventor, and photographer. Well, welcome, Jody. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for being here with us.
Katie, thank you so much. And thanks for what you're doing to try to improve the care that we deliver.
We're all in this together, Jody. And I believe that together we can change our culture of medicine.
I do too.
Yep. Well, I always like to start out for our audience to get a better understanding of how you were able to develop your own expanded empathy and compassion for your patients, and then your own personal journey of transformation along the way.
When I started, I was, aware of patients and their needs, but I didn't really understand what it was like to actually be a patient or to experience healthcare and kind of the terror and helplessness that you feel as a patient. And that was, so I kind of described that I had a sort of emotional armor, that I was present, but, had a lot of training in being distant or in keeping myself detached, that those were, preferred modes of being. And I realized with my sister's illness, that kind of all came crashing down. I saw that really wasn't possible. And also I kind of recognized a paradox that actually by experiencing grief or by going through and connecting with your emotions, that actually is a position of strength rather than a position of weakness. And I think that the walling off or the trying to protect ourselves or keep ourselves distant actually for me is more corrosive and more damaging. And so that was a real kind of game changer for me. And I felt that was something I needed to get out to other people, because a lot of us have learned that we are to keep ourselves distant, keep ourselves detached, not let things affect us, maintain compartmentalization. And while that's important and, is necessary in how we move between, you look at, say, a neurosurgeon and you say, okay, I've got to go and be present with a patient, have a very kind of wrenching conversation with them, and then moments later take them to surgery. I have to be able to kind of keep some distance or compartmentalize my emotional self, but I can't do without having that emotional contact. At the same time, I can't be overly connected. I have to have some barriers. And that's where we get into the whole idea of emotional agility and kind of the flexibility that you want to be able to be present. You want to be able to connect meaningfully with patients. That's ultimately better for them, but it's also better for you. But at the same time, you have to be able to kind of turn that on and off and flex that. And I think we have no training in how to do that in medicine, and it's an essential skill that we need to develop.
Mm-hmm. And so, how did your experience going through your sister's cancer? How did that affect you and help you gain a better understanding of how to maybe change your ways of being a doctor and showing up? How did that impact you?
So first off, I was able to see kind of through her eyes what it was like to be a patient, that every one of us has a history that predates our illness. When you get put in the hospital, you lose your clothes, you lose your identity, you lose your everything that kind of connects you with your prior self. For my sister, she had beautiful hair. She lost that was all shaved, and so she became a patient. And we tend to objectify and dehumanize people and no longer see them as the vital people that they are. But the thing is that that was the same with when Pat was in a coma in the ICU with a drain in his head, is that, we tend not to know the people that we're caring for, especially in a critical crisis situation, but that's sort of who they are and defines them. And it's important for us to kind of keep that connection, to keep that awareness of them as people, their lives, their goals, their struggles, their families, what they want. And I think so having that realization that we need to stay connected with the person and their family and their goals was a very important realization. And I kind of knew it in the background, but I didn't really know it in the way that it became clear to me.
I see. And so I'm curious, as a neurosurgeon, you probably are, you've got the technical aspect of what you're doing, you've got the crisis aspect and the urgency to some surgeries. How do you practice emotional agility now today? And
I think that's actually really a challenge, but I think ultimately that's where a lot of the reward in practice is being able to connect meaningfully with patients, but then also to take that sense of compassion into the operating room to, even though your patient's under anesthetic, you still respect their wishes and who they are, that informs you as you're doing things. And there's a lot to master, but I think it's also really important to be able to have that technical expertise and those skills, but at the same time to keep that person in forefront of your mind. And I think one of the things I think is important is a realization that sometimes that this is more than one individual person can do. And I think that sometimes we need to build teams to work together to be able to help each other, manage some of these issues. I'll give you an example, which is that in my brain tumor program, we embedded a palliative care nurse in the program. And I saw that when I went with Matt Manning, who's in the book and is a radiation oncologist, that we would talk to patients and we would kind of discuss with them what was going on. And I realized that a lot of times I was dumping a lot of information on them, what a surgery would be like, what we would do, how we would have to do it. We were talking about radiation. We were talking about all the treatments. So there's an awful lot of us talking and not as much listening. And I think that sometimes it was very helpful to get a sense of a patient's desires and a family's desires through the palliative care nurse. Mary would come out and say, this is what this person wants and cares about, and it really informed our decision making. So sometimes I think it's a little bit difficult to be able to load yet another responsibility onto a surgeon and say, okay, you got to master all the technical, you got to master, the electrical, all the things that you're doing, which is a lot. And then on top of that, you have to keep on top of the emotional. So I think sometimes it's okay to say, well, let's team up, let's work together, let's build a stronger program. And that's one of the things that I've been advocating for is in terms of palliative care and bringing palliative care into neurosurgical practice, is having better communication earlier on with patients and families. When Pat had a aneurysm rupture and coma, we didn't really get palliative care involved until right at the end. And it felt as if it was more like a funeral planning than really helping guide treatment. And so I think that getting that all involved much earlier, getting more communication on a meaningful level early on is important for families and for patients.
Mm-hmm. And so is the palliative care nurse on your team, does she work with every patient or just ones that have more of a grave prognosis?
Every patient.
Every patient. Okay.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, if they don't need it, if there's not really, if it's very routine and there's not a lot of concerns, then we don't do that. But if there's any kind of, concerns, or either from the clinical team or from the patient, or we think it would be useful, then we'll definitely do that.
Mm-hmm. And so can you talk a little bit about that process of how you've created that team with a palliative nurse, and maybe a little bit about how you frame the foundation of that? So like if she's giving you feedback daily on each patient, or is she part of rounds, like a little bit around that?
Well, so, in our program, what we've done is we have met weekly to kind of review patient situations, but there'll also be consultations along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example of in our ICU. I've tried to build a program with our health system where we have palliative care nurse practitioners to basically interface with patients and families on an earlier basis and regularly. The problem is, we tried to build that program, but hit budgetary constraints where they said, well, it's, too expensive and it's unclear how it's going to make money. And so I think we're oftentimes up against a lot of competing imperatives, which is it better? How do we take great care of patients and build the team that we would want to be served by, at the same time recognizing that there is some cost in this, and it does require an investment from the health system in making sure that quality care is provided.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, Jody, we have data on compassion in improving compassionate care with patients actually improves medical outcomes.
Right.
And communication does as well. So my sense is that it's probably profitable and beneficial for the healthcare system to somewhat invest in this.
It absolutely is, and I find that to be one of the most confusing things about all of this, is trying to move systems and move cultures and say, well, we really need to bring compassion in. And they say, well, what's the return on your investment? Well, it sort of depends how you look at it, right? If, for example, that people will look at narrowly at like length of stay, but I mean, if you really invest in compassion and you really provide compassionate care, then patients are going to be happier, families are going to be happier, everyone will feel better. Nurses, doctors will feel supported. They won't leave. They won't, retire early. And so it really, when we were at the Burnout Symposium, a figure I had heard was, a burned out physician costs a minimum of $1.5 million to replace. So you look and you say, do I put in programs and do I support personnel along the way, or do I wait for a crisis where people quit, leave, and then you have to replace them? So I completely agree that compassionate care is the way to improve things. I've talked to a lot of our administrators. I say, if you don't go for the HCAP survey, instead you just say, we're going to really lean into compassion and make that the foundation of the care that we provide, you'll blow those surveys right out of the water. People you'll want to see, if we provide the compassionate care that we ourselves want and that we know we need to provide and that we can provide, staff and physicians and personnel will feel supported. They won't leave. They won't quietly quit. And the patients and families will feel supported as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very cost effective, but trying to convince people of that is sometimes a challenge.
Yeah, and I think yes, it is. And sometimes it helps to evaluate, like to pilot maybe a small program in one area of the healthcare system and see how it goes over a year and get the feedback on that, and then scale if it's
absolutely
accepted.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about emotional agility, and you really go into detail in your book about that. You mentioned how developing emotional agility can really help buffer burnout and prevent burnout. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I would say that when you try to wall yourself off from grief and you try to wall yourself off from the emotional impacts of practicing, it doesn't work. Okay. So a lot of the notions of, keeping our distance doesn't really work. I think that's ultimately more corrosive than leaning into it. But then if you lean into it, you have to have some skills to be able to experience grief, you have to have time to go through that. You have to have the support of your coworkers. We tend to do this very in isolation, where you have a grief-filled experience and you tend to withdraw, or you do that on your own time. I'm teaching medical humanities to medical students, and one of them said to me a few weeks ago, I had a patient die, and basically nobody talked about it or processed it. We said, well, it was a very difficult experience for this person, and there was no recognition of that and no debrief. And so I think we need to allow ourselves to experience grief. I think we also need to allow ourselves to experience the awe and joy of medicine. I think it's a joyful, privileged thing to be able to do. And so it's kind of as if you take the instead of looking at the world in black and white, you suddenly look at it in color. You see the highs and the lows. You see and you see that the fragility of life is also its beauty. So I think recognizing these things allows us to live more fully and to appreciate the joys and the sorrows of life.
Yeah. And Jody, you bring up a really good point in that I think during the day, we're so focused on logistics, and medicine has become more just about getting your notes done, getting the documentation completed, the next, staying on time. And we, as physicians, I feel like we have to create the space in our day to celebrate the wins with our team, to celebrate the joys, and to take time to debrief for traumatic events that happen. And the system does not necessarily build that into our day, depending on where we work. So I wonder how have you been able to do that for yourself? How have you been able to build in time for that?
I think it's required a pretty significant rethinking of how I do my job, and it is not easy and not obvious. But I also think so. One of the things I personally am doing is, I think that there's a real deficit in education, and I've been trying to go to medical students and early trainees to talk about these things so people become more comfortable with the concept, because I think it's hard later on in practice and in training to say, okay, we're going to suddenly bring these skills in. I think these are things that you need to learn and work on for a long time. But that said, I think it's hard in my practice. I kind of grew up in a productivity, efficiency focus, and to recognize that you can't do that and still, have joy in your practice. So it means slowing down. It means taking more time. It means being present. And I think that a lot of times it's a willingness to allow yourself to go there. And, we talk about empathy with patients. It takes 17 seconds to have an empathetic relationship with a patient. All you really need to do is a willingness to kind of open your heart, a willingness to allow yourself to be present, a willingness to share yourself and to share that other person's suffering. And I think that's the most profound and meaningful experience, whatever kind of medicine that you practice, but you have to allow yourself to go there. And patients really crave that. Patients want that connection. They want to know that you care. They want to know that you care about them. And I used to think that it was all about perfection, and neurosurgeons tend to be fairly perfectionistic in terms of what we do, but it's not perfection. It's really a willingness to support someone on the journey of their illness and to be present and to be there, and that's where the meaningful connections come from.
So Jody, and this is just more of an interesting question I want to know about. How do you prepare yourself? Like, how do you reset in between, surgical procedures and meeting with patients and families? How do you create that space and reset between encounters?
Well, I should tell you right now, I'm actually not working because I've had an injury in my arm and had to have surgery. So I've discovered, so I'm in the middle of a kind of a big reset for me.
Wow. Well, congratulations. I'm sorry you had to have surgery, but I'm glad you're doing well.
Well, I'm doing well, but it is, so I think that, before I got in this position, I've been really leaning into those qualities of connecting with patients and with families. And I think that it is something that has allowed me to experience the joy of practice and the joy of being a physician. And I think that sometimes you feel when you try to wall yourself off, or when you just kind of create yourself as a production machine, you lose that joy. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think it was important to talk, and we talked at the Burnout Symposium, is that this is a source of burnout. But I also think that if you lean into these things and they are important to you, one of the things that we also have to have is a partnership with the health systems and with the organizations we work in that support us and that allow us to do these things. So I think that kind of partnership is really crucial, because without that partnership, if you experience grief and sadness and connect with patients, and then you say, well, I really don't want to be spending, 50% of my time on the electronic health record. Can you support me? And the answer is no. I think that actually makes the burnout worse. So I feel that restoring our sense of purpose, building our sense of community with our fellow practitioners, recognizing that we're not alone and that we're all going through similar things and that we have each other to support, but then also expecting or demanding of the organizations that we work with that they start to look seriously at making our tasks better suited to allowing us to do the things that we're there and that we're inspired to do. For example, electronic record is something that we should get help with. It shouldn't be something that you just say, oh, I'm going to do my charting in nights and weekends and just, so I think when we're faced with unreasonable expectations, we have to address those and we have to be able to change those. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example that I experienced in surgery, which is, it's an amazing thing. When I injured my elbow, I discovered that, I thought it was my own problem and this was a unique thing. And I discovered that actually surgeons have a very high rate of musculoskeletal injuries related to, repetitive work, repetitive use. So we're not trained on that. I was surprised by that. And then you look and you say, well, actually, there's a lot that can be done in terms of ergonomics and for safety and for, if you wear in surgery, I wear a heavy lead apron, which puts me in a flexed position. I wear loops to magnify my, vision, and also a headlamp. And I'll do that for like 10 hours a day. And after 30 years, my elbow said, I don't know, I can do this anymore. And so I feel that for me, it's a kind of a microcosm of what can be done, which is let's look at not just caring for the patients, let's look at also caring for the providers. Let's recognize that, the compassion and the self-compassion piece are not just like, we always look at the self-compassion as just sort of an add-on, like, okay, you need to care for everybody else. Mm-hmm. And then when you have some spare time, you can do yoga and all the things to sustain yourself. And the recognition that self-compassion and compassion are obverse sides of the same coin. They are the same thing. We need to be compassionate to ourselves. We need to be compassionate to each other. And then we can also be compassionate to patients. But if you look and you say in the operating room, well, what would that look differently? Well, let's look at safety. Let's look at comfort. Let's look at ergonomics. Let's look at trying to make things better. And there are things like taking mini breaks and doing stretches during surgery. There's a lot of things you can do to kind of for prevention. And I feel that what we're doing in healthcare is we're pushing everybody along as fast as we can, expecting as much out of them as we can, discarding people when they don't, when they're no longer productive. It's when in the symposium, when Dr. Maslach said, we're the canaries in the coal mine. And the thing is, what we're tending to do is saying, well, we need to make a more resilient canary. And I'm saying, well, we probably need to fix the mine so it's a more joyful place to work where we are supported. So that in that example, you look and you say, well, we can do things to support and protect each other and to make it safer to do our jobs. And that that's again a sort of an example of an investment. You look and say, well, what does that mean? Well, it may mean different equipment, or it may mean, looking at different ways of doing things, a willingness to look at how to do things differently. It might cost something up front, but in the end, if you stay practicing and you are able to, do your job well for longer, in the end, that's an investment worth making.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love those suggestions that you give as well. They're great examples of how to create more room for self-compassion, especially in the operating room. And you're right, Jody. I feel like, especially as a psychiatrist and all the stuff that I've been through in my own personal life, my ability to give compassion to patients and my team is at the level of my ability for self-compassion. And so if I'm having a rough day and being extra critical of myself, I notice that it's much harder for me to be there for my patients and my team. So being able to take a step back and check in on that can really reset my day for myself and everyone. And people know too, our team knows when we show up, and our patients know when, we're kind of distracted or not being fully present. And so I think I really like, your examples on really being more mindful throughout the day, and in educating your team as well on self-compassion, so we can help each other throughout the day.
Yeah, I think that the whole notion of add-on responsibilities to individuals is probably not the way to go, and building team structures that are sustaining and supporting is going to be much more powerful. With the model of bringing palliative care to the neuro ICU, there's some of the physicians don't really talk with patients and families well, or want to. And so this concept is that we're going to support those, and yet at the same time achieve a better level of care and communication. And after I wrote my book, I went and I did training in palliative care at Harvard in something called Palliative Care Education and Practice Program, and it was fascinating. But the majority of of the education was in better communication, in being able to speak with patients, speak with families, listen. And I found it fascinating. But I also think it's in a job where we are basically interviewing people and communicating, we really aren't taught how to communicate effectively. We aren't taught, we did this in the small groups in that course. We did role playing where we'd be the patient, or we'd be the family member, we'd be the provider. And it was amazing how much I learned about how I need to do a better job communicating. And then when you look at, I've had some articles in the New York Times kind of looking at the decision-making in fraught and difficult positions, say, for example, subdural hematoma, and whether to remove it. And there's been a bunch of research on this, but, we make huge decisions with very little communication that have big consequences. And we need to have a better training. I guess this comes with the emotional agility, but I would also say better training in how to communicate effectively to patients, to families, and to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you shared that you even did additional training in palliative care, because I think as physicians, one of the feedback we've been getting with the whole resiliency languaging is that, we're the most resilient population out there, right? I mean, with everything we've been through. However, I have learned over the years, even as a psychiatrist, that there is a way to fine tune how I communicate and how I self-regulate throughout the day. And it's a practice, it's a daily practice. And I kind of want to encourage everyone listening to this podcast today to just be open-minded to that, because yes, we are the most resilient population in the world. However, I think that we can improve how we communicate and how we self-regulate.
I think that's true. I think that's good advice.
And it's made me a better doctor, and it's made me a happier doctor, honestly. Because I'm not letting the resentments build up throughout the day, and I'm addressing things as they come up, and taking breaks for myself. But I have to kind of be in charge of my own schedule and make time and space to reset between patients. And that really makes a big difference for me.
I think for us to be true to our sense of purpose, I think that we oftentimes don't really articulate our sense of purpose. Like, what is our real drive? We tend to allow ourselves, sort of apprentice-based training. You kind of you team up with someone who you want to emulate and model yourself after, but really taking the time to say, hey, what is my purpose? What are my goals here? And then to work, diligently towards those. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to work with organizations which are top down, kind of, that tell you what to do, how to do things. That's really not going to work. I think we need to, if we're the people who are dealing with the patients and are, upfront in those experiences and relationships, that kind of needs to be a driver for how does an organization work to facilitate meaningful, compassionate interactions with patients and families. And if I'm an administrator, if I'm in the C-suite, I'm saying, well, not kind of, you need to see, X number of patients and keep your productivity and efficiency, but kind of, what are the things that I can do to help you do your job better? And if people start listening and kind of supporting each other, and it's more of that sort of team-based idea rather than a kind of leadership, as I said, top down, I think then we start to change how things work. I think that people feel supported. I think that, if safety and ideas or kind of mission, passion for what we're doing drive an organization, and that's kind of a part of the compassion part, then I think we're in a good place in terms of having a program that really works to support each other and to support patients.
Well, Jody, are there any last messages that you would like to share with our audience today, or anything that you want to highlight from our discussion?
Well, I'm delighted to be able to speak with you. And I think that having, I guess I would say, teamwork and compassion driving decisions and care are kind of key.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone listening to this wants training on emotional agility or further education on this, where would they go for that? Or how could they reach out to you and contact you?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. I mean, I would love for people to read my book. I think it's a helpful kind of guide in sort of managing some of these matters. There's a book by Susan David called Emotional Agility, which is a very good kind of primer on how to do this and how to try to work the balance and make some of these transitions. But I think that it is a very positive step. And I think that, if you know the healing arts, are you familiar with that program? It's a program that's taught in medical schools, and I've been facilitating it. And so Rachel Naomi Remen wrote some books about, grief and allowing and awe. And I was amazed when I found all those, because it's a lot of the same stuff that I'm talking about, that she was talking about many years before. So I think there's a real need for bringing humanity and healing back into medical care and bringing compassion back in as the core value of medical care.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. And, I really appreciate you sharing your own experiences, Jody, and your own vulnerability today. I think as leaders, it's really important for us to share our vulnerability and to share our processes for evolution and growing, because it helps to create this culture. And this is what will help shift our culture of medicine to one of more compassion.
I completely agree. And I think all the data is there to say that if you have compassion as the core value of your organization and truly honor that, great things will happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. And it sounds like great things are happening for you at your organization. And I thank you so much for all of the leadership work that you're doing to train medical students and residents and other physicians as well. So
you're doing a great service for us all and kind of spreading the word. And I'm very grateful to you for that.
Thank you, Jody. Well, everyone, Jody will have Dr. Stern will have his own webpage on my website. And on that page, I'll be putting links that we talked about today, along with a link to his book. I highly recommend that you read it. And I also will have any other information available for you as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Jody. And again, I just appreciate you so much for being on the podcast today.
My great pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.